Hey everyone, welcome back for week 2. We are going to be going through all of your questions that you guys had from last week, as well as any new questions you have. And simply add your questions in the comments right below here. So in this little live stream feed, you can ask your questions, and we'll do our best to go ahead and answer everything for you guys as we continue through with our, now week 2 of stay-at-home CFI training. So whatever questions you guys do have pertaining to the written exam, whether it's private pilot, instrument pilot, commercial, whatever it is, simply let us know and we'll go ahead and do our best to answer those for you. We're here on YouTube and then of course on learn.flyatmikealf.com as well. That's our main site where we'll be posting up all these after the fact so that you can go back, review, and figure out any questions that were asked from previous weeks. Maybe your question was already answered in there. So let's go ahead and jump into now first just a couple of the questions that we had left over from last week. One of those was, or two of them were actually weight and balance related. One that's a fairly common one that we see is moving a weight on a plank. So we'll go ahead and go through this guy. If it's not full screen there, that would help. And we'll drag it over here for you. A really common question that you'll find on private pilot, commercial pilot, and even your CFI written exams that people are kind of struggling with. How is it that we go ahead and calculate this equation here, right? So how should the 500-pound weight be shifted to balance the plank on the fulcrum? Luckily, we've got, this one's already pre-narrated, so let's go ahead and just watch through the video. If you guys have any questions on this, we'll go ahead and address them.
All right, so let's think back to when you were trying to balance a seesaw when you were a kid and one kid was bigger than the other. You're trying to get that thing to balance. This is the exact same principle. We're trying to balance upon our datum point right there, and we want the left side to be in equilibrium with the right. We want the left to equal the right. So we need to figure out how much we have to move this 500-pound weight to make that happen. So let's just go ahead and write 500 times x, and that's going to equal, x is going to be the distance. Right now it's 15, but we want to know how much we have to change it is the question, how much to be shifted to balance the plank on the fulcrum with the 250-pound weight there and the weight of the plank. So 500x, some distance, is going to equal 250 times 20 plus a 200-pound plank with a CG of 15 inches. So 200 times 15. We do that math, and 250 times 20 is going to be 5,000. And then we have 200 times 15 equals 3,000. So we have 8,000 on the right-hand side. We need that to equal on the left-hand side. So we have 500x equals 8,000. So 8,000 divided by 500, right? Back to basic algebra. Divide by 500, and x is going to equal 16, and that is the correct answer. The possible answers we have are 1 inch to the left, 1 inch to the right, 4.5 inches to the right. Well, we want to go 1 inch to the left, which will make 15 become 16, and that is our answer.
All right, so hopefully that made some sort of sense. Yeah, of course, hopefully we all washed our hands before tuning in today. If you guys do still have questions on that one, you can, of course, like we said, just type them in to the little live chat here, and we'll go ahead and answer them for you. We are glad we made it off the boat as well. So, and we made it off the boat about 2 weeks ago. This is week 2 already of our CFI Live series of answering your questions as we sit here stuck in quarantine. Now, the next question we had was another performance calculation we'll run through here, and then we'll start addressing some of the questions that were here in the live chat. So let's go ahead and pop open this next
On this question here, they're asking us what true airspeed, that's going to be our answer. We're trying to find the true airspeed should the pilot expect with full throttle at 10,500 feet with a temperature of 36 degrees Fahrenheit above standard. So let's look at this chart here. This is for 65% maximum continuous power or full throttle. So this is good. So we're looking at the right chart here. And we want to see here 10,500 feet. So we'll come over to the 10,500 mark, which is going to be interpolated right between 10 and 12. We're going to come across the chart here. And we're going to see that at 36 degrees Fahrenheit above standard, so that's going to be ISA plus 20 Celsius or ISA plus 36 Fahrenheit. ISA is International Standard Atmosphere. So we're looking at this chart here, this area. We're going to ignore these guys. We're going to come across from 10,000 and read that the true airspeed should be 166 knots. Now our possible answers to this question are 190 knots, 159, or 165. So we can see that 166 is not quite the right answer, but if we're going to interpolate somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000, and 12,000 is 163, we can see there's 3 difference. So from 10,000 feet up to 12,000 feet, we actually lose 3 knots in true airspeed, and we're going to be 25% of the way there. We're going to be heading towards losing 3 knots by going from 10,000 to 10,500. Well, then we can say 165 is the correct answer.
All right, so hopefully that's simple enough for you. These are fairly simple, straightforward questions on the written exams, but people still struggle with them. I mean, it was confusing to me when I first got into this stuff, so totally fine to have some questions on there. And the last thing that we want to dive into from last week is actually an instrument question. So we'll go ahead and pull open one of our little approach plates here. We had a question on an approach plate. SkyVector is probably my favorite website to dive into for this stuff. Question on the approach plate going into Venice. So we'll open up Venice, Florida. And let's see here. We've got the RNAV to runway 31. It was going north there. So the question we had was, what are these altitudes here, basically? The 2,000, 2,600, 2,000, 2,800. What do those altitudes do? And what they are technically, what they're technically called is a TAA, a Terminal Arrival Area. Now, what is a TAA? That is actually a published portion of the approach. It's not an MSA, not a minimum safe altitude. Minimum safe altitude is that little advisory thing that we have up here in the top right-hand corner that says, hey, within 25 nautical miles of the airport, if you're at this altitude, you probably won't hit anything. Well, that's great, but we can't use that altitude to descend to, and it's usually a fairly high altitude. What this is here is, say that we're approaching from, and here's LAIC on the approach, then this is just kind of overlaid to the side. There's LAIC over there. So let's say that we are down over on the, I don't know, southeast side of the airport, down where my little overlay of me is right here. So where my face is, and we want to fly towards the LAIC, and then, of course, shoot the RNAV 31 into Venice. Well, if an ATC has you at, say, 4,000 feet, and you're 20 miles out here somewhere, 20 miles from LAIC, and they say, you are cleared for the approach to runway 31, and that's basically it. All right, proceed direct LAIC, cleared for the approach to runway 31. Well, your last assigned altitude was 4,000. Typically, we hear that whole maintain such and such altitude until established, fly heading, blah, blah. It might sound something more like fly heading 270, maintain 4,000 till established, clear runway, RNAV runway 31 approach into Venice. Or it could just be fly heading 270, clear for the approach, RNAV GPS runway 31 into Venice. The reason is the 4,000, that your last assigned altitude, will no longer apply if you're within 20 miles of LAIC, actually 30 miles of LAIC. You can see that if we're coming from over this area here, there's going to be no procedure turn when we hit LAIC, and as long as we're within 30 miles of it, we can descend down to 2,600 because wherever we are, we're on a published portion of the approach. You don't have to be on a thick black line to be on a published portion of the approach at this point. So if you're out here, and you hear that approach clearance, you are cleared for the approach, you're 20 miles from LAIC, and you're given proceed direct LAIC, cleared for the approach, then go ahead and descend down to 2,600. Once you hit 15 miles from LAIC, you can descend down to 2,000 feet, and then proceed inbound at 2,000 feet all the way until, we'll go ahead and bring this up here a little bit for you guys. We'll proceed inbound to LAIC, 2,000 feet, and then start on down from there. Once we're past LAIC, we can go down to 1,600, no lower than that. And that's going to be our final approach fix at Anlu. And then after that, we can go ahead and continue on the approach down to 680 for Zurich, and then our minimums, whatever they are. If we're circling 500 LNAV or MDA, that's going to be for 360. And I know that doesn't show up there. Unfortunately, that's so annoying. at the bottom of the plate won't show up there, but hopefully that answers the question anyways of what these altitudes are here. Those are, it's a TAA. What we see here is called a TAA, terminal arrival area. This entire area within 30 miles of Lake, 30-mile radius, is a arrival area. It is a published portion of the approach, and you can descend to those altitudes if you are cleared for the approach. It will void your last altitude assignment if you already received that approach clearance. So hopefully that gives you some clarity there. Let's go ahead and jump into these questions. If you have any other questions about everything that we've just talked about, feel free to put them in the comment stream here. We'll start diving into the rest of them here. So we've got any thoughts on ATP versus L3 Flight Academy? Well, here's the deal, Danny. Any of those larger flight academies are fine. The issues they have, especially a month ago, when we were really short on CFIs, was they didn't have a good base of very experienced CFIs to hire from, and most of the CFIs working there were fairly new. Not the end of the world. I mean, they could be good, right? But typically you have somebody that just barely gets through the program. 250 hours, they become a CFI, they start teaching, and they aren't that great a teacher because they struggled with the program, and then they make some not so good CFIs themselves, and those guys are there and they teach, and it's just kind of the blind leading the blind, and that's what you see at a lot of those big flight academies, especially a month ago. Now, in the future here, in the next few months, we're going to have more experienced pilots available on the market because things have slowed down just a little bit. There's a lot of people stuck at home, and so we have a few extra CFIs to go around, so we're not so stretched so thin there. Honestly, I'm just not a huge fan of the 141 deal. I think it's expensive. I think you can get the same or better training in Part 61, and those big brand name flight academies, over and over again, you see them advertise a number, and guys are not finishing for that number. They either finish right at it or above it. They never finish cheaper. I've seen guys in Part 61 get their commercial multi-engine and CFI for all in the $30-some thousand range, under 40 grand easily, time and time again, if they're very diligent about it. And then you see places like ATP, which is Part 61, but they're advertising 60, 70 grand. And guys are coming out of there $100,000 in debt. So I'm not really that thrilled with it. I've heard some weird things from the bigger academies, no one in specific, but I've heard some things about maintenance issues there and just not the best quality instruction. I mean, obviously, the guys that are instructing there are just trying to get their hours and move on. So not that I'm a fan of really either of those options. I would look more locally at your local flight schools, research what AOPA has in their reviews of what flight schools in your area have received awards from AOPA. Try to figure out, who is, really doing good instruction out there, who has great reviews. Look on Google, look at any other review service, talk to other students from the school that have already finished the program, see what they say. But I'm not a huge fan of those big box, big brand name schools. Just don't think they're really all that great. But anyways, hopefully that answers that for you, Danny. ATP versus L3, it's probably going to be about the same. L3 might be a little better. Anyways, weight and balance. Daniel, what's up, Daniel Cash? At Lyft in the same type program. Oh, ATP and Lyft are the same type program. Looked in both. Yeah, it's all pretty similar. Dan, I don't know if you have a question on weight and balance, but if you do, go ahead and put it in that live stream chat there. How do you feel about technology in the cockpit for students, things such as iPad? And if you like them, what would you recommend? Well, Patrick, awesome question. Technology in the cockpit, great thing. But what I will say is it's got to be used the right way. So cell phones, super handy thing. Don't just put it on vibrate or silent or whatever, because it still lights up the screen. So when I go flying, what I use is do not disturb mode, wherever that is right there. And that means my screen's not going to light up. It's not going to vibrate. It's not going to alert me that I got a phone call or anything like that, because I don't want to be distracted by it. I do like leaving my phone on because in the event I need it really quick, or weather's not looking so great, well then I can go and I can say, hey, my radar. And if I've got 4G service, well then I can get in cockpit weather with a little bit more detailed resolution than I'm getting off my ADS-B stuff. Obviously, we don't have onboard weather radar on our Cessna 172s and stuff because it would cost more than the airplane does. So technology in the cockpit, great thing. It's got to be used the right way. Have to have the right modes, all that sort of stuff. understand that, if you're using this thing in the sun with full bright on and you got it plugged in and you're charging it, it gets hot. Battery fires are a big deal. If it ever does catch fire, putting water on them, not a good idea. Can usually feed a lithium ion battery fire. They do have actually on the airlines special containment bags that you're supposed to put the phone into or an iPad into if it gets hot in an airplane, because a fire on an airliner at 30,000 feet is a big deal. It is for us as well. Honestly, if I ever thought my phone was catching fire, if it was melting or whatever, it would probably get chucked out the window, because I don't want to have a fire in the airplane. Not that that's the best thing to do, to throw a flaming device out of your window, but better than it being in the airplane, I guess, for me anyways. As far as where you mount these things, that's a big deal. You do not want people that put phones or iPads on their leg. The problem is they're looking down constantly. They're not looking outside to see traffic. Every time they move their head, they move the yoke a little bit, and they kind of upset the attitude of the aircraft, whether it's instrument flying or visual flying. It's not really clean. When you put it somewhere on the windscreen, or suction cup to the windscreen, well, now you're blocking part of your view for traffic if you're flying VFR. And if you put it on the yoke, if it's a phone, it could be okay. If it's a whole iPad, it gets pretty bulky. You want to make sure it's not going to interfere with your flight controls. The real issue is we don't have a good place in our general aviation airplanes to put our devices, because our cockpits are small. Now, if you look at our Cessna 170, which we can pull up here in tons of our different videos, the way the panel is laid out on that thing is pretty cool. I gotta think of if this video has it. It probably does. So
trouble hearing.
And of course, we're gonna listen to an ad. But we'll go ahead and pull up here for you what our panel looks like and how we mounted that iPad in there, because that's definitely a crucial part of being able to use it effectively, is having the right mount in there. So let's see here. Here's another ad. But in a minute here, we'll actually be able to see the iPad and how it's mounted on the panel there. So having it right in the middle, super handy in this airplane, because for the most part, it's a VFR airplane. So we have the iPad right there matched to the panel. It doesn't obstruct our view at all, and we have great access to it. So we've got our G5s on the left side of the panel. We've got our JPI on the right side. All your instruments, of course, over on the left. The only problem with this setup is that the turn coordinator is now over on the right, so the ball and everything's moved over to the right there. It's kind of odd. And then the Garmin 430, the biggest problem here is the Garmin 430, really important for IFR flying, is down on the bottom right under the panel, and it's very difficult for the pilot sitting in the left seat to get to. So I'm not sure if we have any more pictures of the panel in this particular episode. This was just one of our vlog episodes, but that gives you kind of an idea of where things are at, right? So we got the G5s over there on the left, backup airspeed, and then you got your JPI, you got the iPad right in the middle, super great having it right there, but then the Garmin 430 is down on the bottom right. So if you're going to be flying IFR with an iPad, there's not a lot of great places to put them. I'd rather have it blocking part of my view and keeping my head in a nice level plane. Definitely don't want it interfering with the flight controls. Definitely do not want it, being down there on your lap. It's just making your head look down like that, not a great idea. So there's a very long answer to what I think about technology in the cockpit. It's awesome when used correctly and mounted in there appropriately. If you want to see, if you guys are bored today, stuck at home, that's a cool video actually. They're getting the pop-up IFR clearance into Flabob Airport in Southern California and going through some fairly nasty IFR conditions through the mountain pass there. How long would it take for a newly minted commercial pilot to become a CFI? Well, Colton, that's a good question. I would say if you just got your commercial today, you could be a CFI if everything went just perfectly right and you had the right person training you and you had dedicated all of your time to becoming a CFI. You could become a CFI in about 2 to 3 weeks. It could be done. If you had already gotten the writtens and everything done before getting your commercial even, which would have been a good idea to get them all done at one time, yeah, I mean, you're really looking at that 2-week mark. It can be done for sure, possibly even a little less, but not like you're going to be the best CFI. I mean, a little bit extra time always helps to just make you a little bit better, because you're going to be going out there and teaching people how to fly aircraft. You want to do a good job and not be giving out bad information or anything. So Realistically, what do we see for CFI training? 1 to 2 months is pretty realistic when guys are dedicating a good chunk of time, but possibly still working a part-time job while they're working towards their CFI. That's pretty realistic for a time frame. As far as time commitment, I would say minimum 40 hours of study time, but that's really on the low end. You're looking at more like 80 to 120. That includes your time going to the airport, flying with an instructor, doing ground lessons with an instructor, and your study time, about 120 hours, 80 to 120 hours to get the CFI. That's kind of minimum. You might think that's a lot, but really an A&P certificate, a mechanic certificate, that takes over 1,500 hours of classroom time, plus some job training and Checkride and all that stuff. So, they're looking at almost 2,000 hours to become a mechanic, and we're looking at, 120 hours to become an instructor. When we've only got a few, 100 hours behind us anyway. So it's really not that big a time commitment in the grand scheme of things. And is it me, or is the volume really low when live? It could, be the fact that I'm not really talking into the microphone that well. But if you guys think the volume is low, we can try to raise it a little bit for you, or at least move the microphone closer to my mouth, because that's kind of how that whole thing works, is if you don't talk in the microphone, it sounds quiet. Let's see what else we have here. And can you please explain the true heading and compass heading with ground speed? All right, Alok. Well, it's if I understand your question totally, can you please explain true heading and compass heading with respect to ground speed? So let's see how I can explain this in a simple way. Well, we're going to have, if we look at trusty sky vector again, so let's say we're going to go from Venice to Sarasota, right? So let's say there's no wind whatsoever to start with here. So we're going from Venice to Sarasota. It looks like it's a course about 348 there. So true course, 348. We've got some magnetic variation in the area, 5 degrees west. West is best, so we add 5. So now we're going to go from 348, and we're going to have, with that 348, we're going to have, they're already doing the wind correction here, we'll ignore that. 348, that's going to make it 353. So we add the 5 degrees west, we get 353 for a compass heading. So if we fly a compass heading at 353 with no wind, we'll get from Venice to Sarasota. Now, let's say we're going to do 100 knots going to Sarasota. Cool. So we're flying 353, 100 knots to get to Sarasota. Now let's say we have a direct crosswind coming from the right of 100 knots as well. Not realistic, but for simple round math, we're going to make it 100 knots. Well, we're going to have to fly at a 45-degree angle, crab angle, for us to actually go straight along this line. Because if we just flew a compass heading of 353 to get to Sarasota, and we had a 100-knot crosswind, and we were going 100 knots over the ground, well, guess what would happen is we'd be 45 degrees off. We'd be flying a 45-degree different ground track. So that would be our actual ground track would be 45 degrees off. And our ground speed would actually be increased because we're going 100 knots this way, 100 knots this way. And so then you could say, well, your ground speed is going to be 40% more. It's that whole, 45, 45, 90 triangle with the square root of 2, all that kind of math there. And the simplest way to explain this is going to be, look, when there's no wind, we fly a compass heading, it works out. When there's a crosswind, we have to crab our airplane. Our airplane can no longer go perfectly straight. We have to fly in a crab to account for that wind, and that will pretty much always decrease our ground speed. Now, if we were just going to fly that original straight path and we had a crosswind also moving the aircraft, well, not only do we get to go this far forward, we also go a little bit sideways, so that increases our ground speed slightly when we have that crosswind. But if we're trying to actually go between 2 points, and we have a crosswind, it's going to decrease our ground speed because it's as if we had to fly over here and the wind blew us back. So overall, our ground speed will be decreased when we have a crosswind in the aircraft. The only time it's going to increase our ground speed is if we have any sort of crosswind that's mostly a tailwind or more of a tailwind. Anytime you get a tailwind, of course, that increases ground speed. So hopefully that answers the question, if I understood the question in the first place. So moving on to the next question here. Someone asked about what you were talking when you were doing the weight and balance question. Oh, I got you. Okay. Danny, thank you for answering the question. AT&T and all three have almost identical prices. The prices reduced around 21K to 27K. I'm not sure what that's for, if that's just for a private or if they say that's going to get you from zero all the way through to commercial, but it definitely wouldn't. There's no way you can get from zero to commercial for 21,000. So, and if you're talking about 21,000 for a private pilot, well, gee, that's kind of a lot of money. So I don't know that. I think you can get a private pilot still nowadays for around 8 to 12,000, depending on where you're at in the country. So I would keep that in mind. Those mom and pop schools are usually the cheapest bets. Can you explain PNR and PSR? Well, I could if I knew what they were, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by PNR and PSR if you're talking about point of no return. But if you clarify that for me, then we'll get back to that. Awesome, Danny. Hopefully, those math problems are fairly simple once you see them explained, so hopefully that helped you out. Let's see. How do you know if your CFI has a license, Diego? That's a great question. Well, that's something that is important, right? Because if your CFI doesn't have a license, not only are they breaking the law, but all that time that you spend flying with them and paying them, you're not going to get to use towards being a pilot. So how do you know if somebody has a license that's actually current? It's totally fair that somebody was a CFI at one point and they just forgot to renew it. I mean, it's just an honest mistake, right? They're supposed to always write their expiration date next to their signature in your logbook, but it's an honest mistake. Could be that they thought they renewed it and didn't, and it turns out to be this huge debacle because now they've been doing something that's illegal, not knowingly, not meaning to, but you can't log any of that time. Well, they weren't current as a CFI and it cost you a lot of money. So let's go airman database is what we want to Google here. We're going to go to amsrvs.registry.fa.gov, click on that guy, and we can look up myself. So Kotwiki, and there's not a lot of Kotwikis out there, so we'll search for that, and we're going to get below here. Myself, Jonathan Joseph, we'll click on that. And what kind of stuff do I have here? Well, we've got ATP, commercial, blah, blah. Okay. Flight instructor, click on that guy. Date of issue, 8/29/2018. So it's good for 2 years. So I've got 4 more months. If this was issued, say, in 2017, well, that means I'm no longer current as a CFI for sure. So that would mean that, well, actually, yeah, that was mostly right. It was issued 8/29/2018. What's funny is it's got an expiration date of 2020. So let me explain that. That's a little different. I renewed it in August. My expiration date was October. And so although it was renewed in August and issued in August, it's actually good until the expiration date that's written down right there. They give you a 3-month window that you can renew it up to 3 months before it expires. And then you have another 24 calendar months after that. So the expiration date, 31st of October. If it's 31st of October and this happened to be November 5th, 2020, then I would no longer be current as a CFI. And this is pretty up to date. So maybe it lags within a week or two, but this database is pretty up to date. And it tells you all certificates that anyone has. So if you want to know if your flight instructor actually has a license, especially say they're a CFI, but maybe they're not a double I. So here's where it says that, right? So flight instructor, airplane single engine and multi-engine, and instrument airplane. So I'm a CFII. It won't say CFII in here. It won't say flight instructor instrument. It just says flight instructor instrument airplane. If it just said flight instructor airplane single, that would just be a basic CFI. An MEI is flight instructor multi-engine. That would be your MEI. So it's what the colloquial terms that we use in aviation are not exactly the same thing that are in the FAA database here. But that is a good question. And occasionally that does happen, usually not because people are doing it maliciously, just because they forget and their stuff doesn't renew. Or sometimes, they say, oh, I can teach you for your instrument, but they're not really a double I. So it's a good thing to double check there, Diego. Is it worth taking out loans to get training done? How will the industry be in 2 years? I'm assuming the industry is going to be amazing in 2 years. It's not going to be amazing in 2 months. It'll be hopefully maybe 6 months, a year, looking better. 2 years, I think it's going to be really good because we will have hopefully gone through the decline and there'll be nowhere to go but up from there. So in 2 years, I think things will be really good. There's always demand for pilots. Even if you get a pilot certificate,
and God forbid, you can't get a job as a pilot, well, there's going to be a lot of drone pilot jobs out there, a lot of stuff flying drones for inspection of towers, for inspection of buildings, whatever. There's a ton of aviation related jobs that you can get into. So I think getting your pilot training done now is a great thing. Whether it's mechanic training, A&P, or private, or commercial, or CFI, whatever it is, now is a great time to be getting more ratings. Now is a time to study, especially while we're all stuck at home. Well, a lot of us are out of work. Now's the time to study, add to your resume, add all that stuff in there. It'll make you much more valuable 2 years from now. Is it worth taking out loans? Yes, because here's the deal. Loans are really cheap right now. Interest rates are super low. And you have to bet that, well, if the government's going to be printing trillions and trillions of dollars like they are, well, inflation's going to go up somewhat. So if you get a loan at 5% interest and inflation is 10%, you're actually making money. You're actually paying back less in the future than you borrowed. If inflation is the same as your interest rate, then basically you're paying no interest. And if interest is slightly higher than inflation, you're paying a little bit of interest. But if your interest rate's 5% and inflation right now is 2%, we're really only paying effectively 3% on that loan. So it's very cheap to borrow money right now. And you definitely run the real gamble kind of benefit of inflation being higher, and now your salaries rise, but your loan principal stays the same, so you're able to pay it off easier. So borrowing money right now, not a bad thing to do in my opinion. The chance of us getting deflation when they're printing trillions of dollars, pretty darn slim. Deflation is the only thing that would make debt harder for people to bear right now. So, is a CPL mandatory if you want to become a flight instructor? Yes, it is, because it's required in the flight instructor regs here. So if we come down to Part 61 in Title 14, we go to Part 61 and we look at instructors. It's 61 flight instructors other than flight instructors with the sport pilot rating. So that would be us, regular CFIs. And then you're going to say eligibility requirements 61-183. Hold either commercial pilot certificate or airline transport pilot certificate. So you either need your commercial or ATP. And so there you go. That it is required to have both your commercial, and it is also required that you have your instrument rating, which is also buried in here. Moving on to the next question. What's more enjoyable, creating training videos or doing one-on-one instruction? I like variety. I sit here, I do a lot of training videos for a week. I get kind of bored. I go back to the airport. I'm so happy back in the airplane, so happy to be interacting with people and teaching. And then after a couple weeks of that, it gets kind of long and tiring and you're ready to go back to video editing. So I do a mix. A lot of times I'll do the instructional videos for half a day. I go to the airport for half a day and instruct. And honestly, it's awesome. I never get bored of that. Having variety is really cool and makes it a lot of fun. Instructing for me is essential because I can't make good instructional videos unless I'm out there actually teaching real people and seeing how my videos affect real students when they go home and watch them, and then they get into the airplane and see how they retain that information and how it influences their actual flying. So that's also part of it for me. It's not just the joy of teaching and helping somebody and getting them through their rating and actually making more pilots. That, of course, is awesome. It's also fun because I get to see how my videos actually play out in the real world, and how our training courses online from flyatmikeelf.com help people through their private or instrument or commercial or CFI or whatever it is, whatever course it is they took with us online. So next one. I'm based out of North Tampa. Cool. X-39, fun airport. Want to get to 1,500 hours. Everyone does, Patrick. And had some difficulty finding a CFI, purchasing an aircraft for a good price, and a good airport, and finding a good airport. Gotcha. X-39 is closest. Suggestions. X-39 is cool. I'm not sure if Angela still owns that place up there. They had some decent airplanes. They had some maintenance stuff with some of their airplanes. I mean, they take care of them, but they're old, beat-up training airplanes. They lease a lot of them back. I don't think they really own any of them. And overall, I don't know. I rented an airplane from Angela years ago when I was doing my CFI training. Wasn't really thrilled that it was burning like a quart an hour
and slinging out most of the oil through the propeller, and the propeller was actually loose in the hub, and you can actually kind of clunk the blade around, and every time you cycled the gear, it smelled like something was on fire. So yeah, that was my experience up there. As far as where you're at, if you're near X-39, if you can make it over to Lakeland, I know it's a bit of a commute, but they've King Sky, I've heard really good things about their flight school. Don't know those guys at all, but heard good things from King Sky over in Lakeland. And there's some other good ones around Vandenberg and around the Tampa area. Clearwater, Tampa Aviation has got a pretty good reputation. They've got 4 locations in the Tampa area, so it might be a little bit of a commute, but hey, traffic's light right now because everyone's staying at home. So and purchasing an airplane, you can buy a 150. There's plenty of 150s out there for $15,000 to $25,000 that are good airplanes. If you can fit into a 150, buy a 150. They're not exciting, but they're good trainers. So, Gija says, because right now I'm just a student pilot, but friends told me that I would be a very good flight instructor. I should try it, and that's exactly what I want to do since I've started flying. Good for you. That'd be awesome. And Cole, what's the manifold pressure gauge measuring? How does more pressure equal more power? That is a great question, Cole. So, manifold pressure gauge. For those of you unfamiliar, manifold pressure gauge. Let's see if we can find some good images here. Well, so yeah, this is what a typical manifold pressure gauge might look like on an airplane. 10 inches being very low, 30 inches being atmospheric. So what's our standard atmosphere? Well, standard atmospheric pressure, if you guys remember, it is 2992, all right? So 29.92, roughly 30 inches. So what does that manifold pressure gauge measure? Well, if the engine's turned off, the manifold pressure gauge actually measures atmospheric pressure. You can pretty much set your altimeter off your manifold pressure gauge. Only reason why I would tell you not to do that is because they're usually only accurate to within like plus or minus 1 inch. And remember, 1 inch equals 1,000 feet on your altimeter, so your altimeter will probably be way off. But in a perfect world, if that manifold pressure gauge was really precise, then it would be measuring atmospheric pressure like a barometer would. And then we could use that setting in our altimeter. Now, what happens with an engine? And I'm trying to think of how I can draw this quickly because it's on the computer and I don't have a whiteboard to draw on. But we're going to say that we have, let's see here, a carburetor diagram is what I want. So we have a carburetor diagram. This is a nice simple one here, all right? So air flows in through the carburetor. We'll try to make this bigger, and of course we can't. So hopefully that's big enough for you guys to see there. So we've got our carburetor diagram here. Air flows in. Ignore the choke valve. We don't have those on our airplanes for the most part. We have a throttle valve. The throttle valve, whether it's open or closed, if the engine's not running, manifold pressure gauge reads 30. Now the engine is down here. It's after the airflow. It's after the throttle plate. So imagine if I open my throttle all the way. I allow air to flow through the engine, and the engine's nothing but a big vacuum cleaner. It sucks air in. It's an air pump. It pulls air in. As those pistons move down, they draw air into the cylinder. It's pulling air in. So if I'm sucking air, if the engine's running, I'm sucking air into the engine, and I close this throttle valve, meaning I pull the throttle out, and the throttle closes, I provide less air to the engine. Well, it makes less power, but it's still sucking air because that prop's turning is trying to suck the air in. And what the manifold pressure gauge is measuring is really not pressure, but vacuum, all right? So it's measuring the suction. So when we close the throttle plate, it decreases from 30 inches atmospheric down to 10 inches, all right, which is a vacuum. It's 20 inches of vacuum, is what you could say, or 10 inches of pressure pushing into the engine. Not that the engine has air pushing into it. When it's not running, atmospheric pressure doesn't push on it. But if we had a perfect vacuum, if we were sucking as much air as possible, and there was absolute zero pressure on the engine, which is what the engine is trying to get to, it's trying to suck air in, and we had 30 inches in the atmosphere, that would be 30 inches of pressure pushing into the engine. So when we open and close that throttle valve, we change the amount of airflow that's able to get to the engine, and that affects the pressure setting. So the manifold pressure gauge is really located downstream of the throttle plate. In between the engine and the throttle plate, it's measuring suction, and that's telling you pressure, manifold pressure. When you open the throttle plate, well, it allows more airflow in, it decreases the vacuum because we're just shoving as much air in as possible, and it goes back towards atmosphere, it goes back towards 30 inches. Now, if I have a turbocharger, which is a pump located upstream of the throttle plate, a turbocharger, like you have on some of your cars and stuff, if that's going to shove more air into the engine so it can breathe more air and make more power, well, now I could get above atmospheric pressure. I could get 32 inches, 35, 40 inches, 50 inches of manifold pressure as I pump more air into the engine. We notice on this particular manifold pressure gauge, this might be a turbo normalized airplane. What that means is, well, as we climb, we get 30 inches at sea level, but as we climb and higher, it makes sense that at 5,000 feet, we'd only have 25 inches of manifold pressure, even if we're full throttle, because there's less pressure up high. So a turbo can supply more air to turbo normalize it, or basically bring it back to 30 inches. If it's turbo normalized, we never really want to go above 30 inches because we just want to normalize the engine, make the engine always feel like it's at sea level compared to it feeling like it is at 5,000 or 10,000 feet where there's less air to breathe. Why we have yellow and red here is because this engine is basically made to run at sea level. It has a turbo to help it out when it gets at higher altitudes, but it's not meant to run over pressure or boost it. It's not meant to run at 31 or 32, 33 or 35 inches of manifold pressure. So that turbo on takeoff down low could potentially supply too much pressure and start supplying too much air to the cylinders, which when you supply too much air, that pump is pushing really hard and those pistons are pushing really hard in there. It increases the pressure inside the cylinders. It damages the engine, could potentially break something. So hopefully that, in a nutshell, it's a lot easier to explain this if we're actually standing in front of an airplane together, touching the parts and pieces and looking at how this is set up. It's a little bit more difficult when I'm just trying to pull up images on Google. But that is ultimately what manifold pressure is measuring, is the pressure between the throttle plate and the engine. The engine's a vacuum cleaner. It's sucking. It's pulling air in. And when you close that throttle plate towards idle, well, you create a lot of suction. The vacuum increases, the pressure falls. That's when you get 8, 10 inches of manifold pressure. When you open this plate up and you allow airflow to come in, well, then the pressure rises, so to speak, and you get towards that 30 inches when you're down there at sea level. So let's see what else we have here. And hopefully that helps out there, Cole. Shocker 31, can you give me your thoughts on entering holding teardrop pattern and RNAV holding pattern that has a 4 nautical mile along track distance assigned you it? Okay. Grammarly helps, by the way. But let's go ahead and look here at a holding pattern. We'll just pull up that same one we looked at earlier here, which was the RNAV to runway 31 in Venice. So let's look at the RNAV to 31. So we have a holding pattern, 4 miles, like you were talking about. Let's see if I understand your question here. Can you give me your thoughts on entering a holding teardrop entry into an RNAV holding pattern that has a 4 nautical mile? Okay, well, so remember, holding pattern entries are recommended. They're never mandatory. You can enter the holding pattern any which way you want, but on the day of your check ride, because we have those recommended entries, you should probably follow them, right? So when would we do a teardrop entry? Well, say we're coming from over here, from the northwest, and we're proceeding inbound to Laic. We would come off at a 30-degree angle and make that teardrop entry. We would simply fly out, and you could either, do you still turn 30 degrees on the outbound course for 1 minute? Yes, so you can definitely do the 1 minute leg, but it is 4 miles. So if you're flying something outrageously fast, like 250, well, hopefully below 10, you're not going faster than 250. But notice it's 4 miles, right? So at 120 knots, it would be 2 miles per minute. At 240 knots, or 250, it'd be roughly 4 miles in a minute. So notice that it's 4 miles, and the fastest you're ever going to go is 250, and nobody's going to fly a holding pattern at 250. So realistically, 1 minute is fine. You don't have to go the full 4 miles. There's no sense in doing that. 1 minute gives you plenty of room to make that turn around. So fly outbound for 1 minute, and your general aviation airplane, that's probably going to be about 1.5 miles. You'll come back around, and the important part is you're staying inside the protected zone. The protected zone is 4 nautical miles with a little bit of room for making those turns. You don't want to be going outside of it. And if anything, you want to make all the turns on the protected side of the holding pattern. You don't want to be coming out here. This is the unprotected side. This is the protected side. They build in some room for error if you get drifted over here a little bit. They don't count on you getting drifting over here. It's there could be some towers or obstacles. Obviously, there aren't because they'd be depicted. But we would just come in, and it's a good question. Yeah, 1 minute at that 30-degree angle, come back around, and then proceed inbound or enter into the hold as you would. But 1 minute's totally fine because you're not going to exceed that 4 mile distance, and you're not going to have winds
that are strong enough, really, unless over 100 knot winds, that would make you exceed that 4 mile distance. So 1 minute is totally fine. Let's see here. Thank you for taking our questions. I'm curious about checklist usage. At what point during the after takeoff checklist do you take your pants off? Okay, I guess I should start reading these to myself before reading them aloud. Thank you, Chad. Yeah, just quit flight training. You're the one guy that can quit flight training. That'd be great. We need less of you. Volume's okay now. Thanks, David. That's awesome. And thanks for looking at Classy Airspace for me this week on YouTube. Cool. At the end of your CFI roll videos, you spoke about additional questions you were going to do a video on. Are they already online? They are on flyatmycalf.com in the CFI course there. And there will be more and more being released. Because of what's going on right now, we're a little bit of a pause on some of that stuff. We're going to be releasing those initially in March and April, and we've kind of slowed those down. We did those in partnership with Lufthansa Aviation Training in Goodyear, Arizona. Awesome school. They're currently they've paused operations. So once they resume operations, then we'll go ahead and put those extra videos out there with all those CFI stumper questions. There's a few online at flyatmycalf.com though that are in the CFI course as well. But once they resume operations, then we'll go back out there and we'll keep doing those videos with them that were initially scheduled for April there. Let's see. Do you endorse the IFR test after taking the IFR course on flyatmycalf.com? Yes, we do, David. Private, instrument, commercial. We'll give you the endorsements for the written exams when you complete our courses on Fly at Mycalf. Just shoot us an email, cfi@flyatmycalf.com, and we will go ahead and send you the endorsement for the test. We just go in, verify it. We'll talk to you, make sure you know everything you need to know. We don't like to just issue the endorsement automatically. We'd like to actually have some sort of communication with you first to make sure you're in good shape before going for the written exams, because we have a 100% pass rate. Everyone passes the written exams when they use our courses, and we want to keep it that way. So we put a little bit of extra work into making sure that you're in good shape when you go for those written exams before just signing you off for it. Let's see. Does 8 Mike Alpha or Flat Mike Alpha have a larger meaning? Eventually, I will make that video, but in the meantime, yes, it does. And stay tuned. That video will come out on YouTube because we get that question all the time, so I will answer that for you guys. Excuse me. Eventually. We'll get that maybe since we have all this time sitting here in quarantine. Mateo Reyes, was creating ground school courses hard work? Yeah, a little bit. Cost quite a bit of money and a lot of time. It's taken us years to build up all these courses that we have here on flyatmycalf.com, and it's a lot of fun, but it is fairly tedious. So far, before this, I didn't know anything about websites or video editing or equipment or anything, and now I know shutter angles and shutter speeds and ISO settings and aperture settings and all the different camera gear and different file formats and AVI and H.264 and MOV and all the different things. I know PHP code, MySQL. Had to figure out all that stuff to actually build the website and put all this stuff together, and just a lot of different crazy little things, API keys, all sorts of weird stuff I have nightmares about now, because all I really want to do is just fly and make videos, and that's a terrible, annoying noise that we'll go ahead and get rid of. But let's go ahead and get back here to the rest of the questions. Let's see here. And John Doe, do you have a light sport rating for training purposes? Not totally sure if I understand what you mean there, John, but light sport rating for training purposes. So there is such thing as a LSA instructor, and you can get a sport pilot instructor license, so different from a CFI where you would just be teaching sport pilots. And if you are a regular private pilot and then you get your instrument, your commercial, and your CFI, and you're a regular CFI, you can teach sport pilots as well. You don't have to have an additional rating or any sort of certificate to teach sport pilots if you're already a regular CFI. But if you just want to be a sport pilot and just want to teach, but you say you can't get a medical or you don't want to get a medical, so you just want to operate as a sport pilot, you have your sport pilot certificate, you can go ahead and become a sport pilot instructor without the instrument rating, without the commercial pilot certificate, without all that stuff. And it's only 150 hours of minimum time to become a sport pilot instructor. Not much flight time there, but of course you can only teach sport pilot students. But you can teach guys in J3 Cubs, you can teach them in Aranca Champs, so it's still a cool thing
to do in fixed wing, or of course, powered parachutes and weight shift and all that. That's really what that category was, I think, created for. Do you have any video or know of any video that explains about pressurized airplanes besides AC-2520? Well, we do a little bit in our CFI course, Hyun. Hopefully I'm saying your name there right. Sorry if I'm not. But we do go over that a little bit in the CFI course. It is pretty basic, pretty generic level, simply of we have airflow coming in, and from some sort of source like a turbocharger or supercharger, we have some control valves, we have outside altimeter, cabin altimeter. It's a pretty basic system in most aircraft, and again, it's not something technically that you have to know about unless you're bringing a pressurized aircraft to your check ride. You should know the very basics of it for your CFI level, perhaps commercial, perhaps, but not really. But if you do bring a pressurized airplane, then you would need to know at least how that system works, and the POH has the best diagrams for that airplane in there. So we don't dive into it terribly deep, but it is something that we go over a little bit in the CFI course. Let's see what else we have here. What part-time pilot opportunities exist for retired non-aviation individuals who want to fly and earn a few bucks? So part-time pilot opportunities exist for, I got you, retired non-aviation individuals who want to fly and earn a few bucks. Well, CFI is probably the biggest one. AGI is a good thing to do if you want to teach ground school at your local place, or just help students out on the ground, getting ready for the written exam, hang out at your local flight school. A&P, that's a really in-demand thing right now. We need mechanics almost more than we need pilots. The pilot shortage was real. The A&P shortage is way more real. So if you don't mind turning wrenches, if that's your thing, then A&P is a great thing to do if you're retired. You can arguably make more money turning wrenches than you can, just as a regular like AGI or something doing ground school. But there's a number of different opportunities in there. And then if you're really trying to earn a few bucks, so it's not volunteer stuff, trying to make a couple bucks with it. The other thing is you can always volunteer with like Coast Guard Auxiliary, if you own your own airplane and you just want them to pay for your gas and stuff. So, I mean, you're not earning a few bucks, but you're at least, paying for your flying habit that way. So that's something. But hopefully that gives you a general idea. Should students get med certificate or use basic med? Well, students have to get a med certificate, Benny, because you have to have a medical certificate at least some point in your life, or within the past 10 years, actually, before you could get basic med. So to be eligible for basic med, you must have held a third-class medical certificate or better within the past 10 years. Students should get a first-class medical certificate, and the reason being is you want to figure out if you have any medical issues that would disqualify you. So go get that first-class medical certificate, even if you are 15, 16 years old, 18 years old, whatever. Go get the first-class med. It's still good as a third class for 5 years, or gives you 5 years of privileges, gives you the first class for 1 year, then 4 years at the third class level. But that is going to be your best bet to figure out, hey, am I eligible for a first class? And if you're not, good thing to figure out now before you pour, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 into becoming a commercial pilot. So let's see. That is a good question, though, Benny. Murad asks, hey, John, what restrictions apply to GPS in terms of R&P? Ooh, that is a loaded one. Okay, so the deal with R&P, required navigation performance, in the real world, it doesn't really apply to us in the United States in general aviation, because all of our equipment's compliant and all of our approaches are at a pretty standardized basic level. RNP is a really loaded one that at the airline level, going oceanic across the Pacific and across the Atlantic gets a lot more detailed, RNP 2, 3, 4, whatever. For the most part, it's not going to apply to us in general aviation. That's why we don't dive into it much. The AIM is your best resource if you look up RNP in the AIM Airman Information Manual, or Aeronautical Information Manual. That's what I would refer you to. Because there's probably a good 10 pages, 20 pages you want to go through of that, and then also some advisory circulars on RNP that really, again, apply more to airlines and across the ocean type stuff when we're going oceanic, because there still is not radar coverage over the North Atlantic or out in the Pacific. When somebody's going from LA to Sydney, they're in and out of radar coverage constantly. And although ADS-B and satellites and all that stuff helps, we still have backups in case that fails, and RNP is
hey, how tight can you navigate? So how many airplanes can we stack going over the North Atlantic at a time in these corridors? How far do we have to separate them level-wise as well as horizontal-wise going across the Atlantic till they get back in radar coverage, and then the controller can take over. So RNP is pretty in-depth, but it really applies just to the big guys, not really so much to us. All of our stuff, is compliant. If you have a Garmin 430, it's good to go shoot this GPS RNAV 3.1 approach into Venice. It's more than sufficient to shoot any RNAV approach really in the country, so that you're going to be shooting anyways. Is a degree necessary or a good idea if you're getting, say, a bachelor's in aviation? Get a bachelor's in anything. It doesn't have to be aviation. A bachelor's in aviation typically is just a business degree with a few more credit hours stacked onto it of aviation classes. Just costs more money. And a month ago when the airlines were really desperate, aviation degrees didn't matter. Just mattered that you had a degree or at least associate's, a 2-year. Now, when we go into pilot surpluses, like we will be in for the next 2 months, 6 months, whatever, where people aren't hiring so much, aviation degrees certainly help on their resume, but I just don't put that weight in them personally myself when I'm hiring people. Do airlines? Maybe not. It's if it's going to cost you a lot of extra money, not really worth it. The biggest thing is having more ratings, more flight time is a lot more valuable than having a degree, because the degree doesn't really help you fly the airplane. Any experience and time in the seat does. So I'd focus more on that rather than the ratings. Go ahead and take the last question here, and then we'll answer any remaining questions that we have here in next week's session. Next Thursday at noon Eastern. We'll be doing this every week at noon Eastern as long as we are on lockdown, until we can go back to regular life. So, hey John, how far out do you go on crosswind during a right-hand traffic pattern? Well, whether it's a right-hand or a left-hand traffic pattern, I typically am going roughly a half a mile or so, maybe 15 to 30 seconds. Again, it depends on the wind, right? So if you're in right traffic and you had a right crosswind on your takeoff, well, you're going to be on the crosswind like a little bit longer, because you want to make sure you're far enough away from the runway that when you turn base, it's not too short of a base leg and you're not going to get blown towards the airport on downwind. So how long really? In your average general aviation airplane, climbing out between, say, 70 and 90 miles per hour, or 70 and 90 knots roughly, well, 15 to 30 seconds is sufficient. A minute is a little bit long, because that's going to take you probably a mile from the airport. It's going to start taking you out a gliding distance from the airport. So 15 to 30 seconds, that's enough time to roll wings level, look around, kind of get your orientation, say, okay, looking good, look over your shoulder, there's the runway, 45-degree angle off the runway. All right, cool, I can go ahead and turn crosswind. A bigger deal is when do you, or turn, from crosswind to downwind. Bigger deal is when do you turn crosswind, and that is going to be if you're upwind of the runway. The AIM recommends around 700 feet, and we have advisory circulars that recommend within 300 feet of pattern altitude, so climbing up to about 700 feet AGL typically. I usually don't do that, because that, in our underpowered airplanes, takes me way too far away from the runway. We did a whole video on this of the impossible turn. So if you want an explanation on flying a pattern of what I think, then let's see if this will pull up here, the impossible turn video. This is what I would steer you towards, not masterclass, although that's a really cool website. I would steer you towards the impossible turn video here, that we go over all this stuff. And basically what we did in this particular video is failed the engine at 500 feet after takeoff, and that's all your available landing areas that we could have gone to, right? So we could have gone to any of those places. We're always keeping a landing area available to us, making sure that we're always pointing the nose in a place where we could land it. And here at 500 feet, when we actually pulled the throttle back to idle and said, oh, hey, look, the engine quit. So there's 500 feet, engine quits. Then we go ahead and we begin that immediate turn back to the airport. And in this particular airplane, with this particular technique, we can turn back at 500 feet, no problem. It is safe to do so. Not safe in all airplanes, and obviously technique is a big key thing. I mean, making a 60, 70-degree bank, very low over the ground, fairly dangerous, but it's safer than landing in somebody's backyard. So again, this comes with a lot of training, a lot of practice.
But you watch this video, that'll give you a good idea of how we like to fly traffic patterns and all the different advisor circulars and mentions in the aim of when you should or should not be turning crosswind, downwind, all that sort of stuff, how to fly your traffic pattern. And I'll give you my 2 cents about it as well in this video. It's on YouTube on our channel there. And I think that's going to be pretty much it for us, guys. We've got a lot more questions here that we will answer for you next week. You can always submit your questions to us at fly@mycalf.com at the Ask a Question tab at the top of the website, or come here to learn.fly@mycalf.com. I'll put the address in there, and that's going to have the actual recordings of these live streams, and then the buttons as well for you to go ahead and submit your questions to us. When we see you back here for next week, next Thursday, noon Eastern. In the meantime, wash your hands, stay safe, and thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you next time. Now I just have to figure out how to turn this off. I always forget. How do I turn off the live stream? There's some button somewhere.